I think this particular session was sparked when Sophia's and Isabel's paper, Christianity Today, did a piece on Beef, the Netflix sort of dark comedy that's just finished the season and gets like a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. Anyway, they have Steve Yeun's character, Danny Cho, sort of enters at one moment a Korean church, and they run the whole thing, come to the altar elevation worship scene. It's like a 3-minute scene. And it went all over. And it was interesting because it was a sense, a lot of times the movies will depict bad religion really well, and sometimes the movies will depict good religion really well. This was a very interesting kind of recent occurrence. And we have two outstanding speakers for you this morning. So anyway, that particular scene, a couple articles, a couple different places, talked about sort of the rawness and vulnerability and breakdown and surrender. Today we basically have a film critic at Vox and a film practitioner, TV producer, showrunner, which is a whole thing I hope we'll learn about more from Brad. If you're not from Hollywood, I have no idea what that means, but it's really important. And in an era of polarization and tribalism, the question is sort of how's the arts, movies, TV, help us to transcend some of the worries we talked about yesterday, from a big decline in public trust to these information rabbit holes, to dysfunctional housing regs in San Francisco, to lingering mental health issues coming out of COVID. Is there some sense in which movies, TV, holding up good, true, and beautiful, help us sort of break through some of that? The title of Alyssa Wilkinson's forthcoming book is We Tell Ourselves Stories. And the tacit assumption is that doing so matters. It's not always exactly clear how, but that storytelling via the arts holds the power to renew. So both speakers, then we're going to take it away. So first we're going to hear from Brad Winters, who is a writer, a producer, and a showrunner. I didn't know this term, but it's like the person who directs the daily on-set production of a television show.
It's a very literal term.
Showrunner.
You run the show.
Yes. And he has helped to direct and produce multiple TV dramas, including Oz, where he started his career as a writer, then Boss and The Americans, The Sinner, and Berlin Station over in Berlin. Brad's the creator of the on-screen and comic book project called America Town, about the world's first enclave of American immigrants who live abroad and work abroad in this sort of dystopian near future. He's also a published poet, contributor to the arts and faith blog at Good Letters at Pathos, which is gets like something like 11 million page views per month. So sort of an innovative platform. And then second, we'll hear from Alyssa Wilkinson, who, as mentioned, is a Vox film critic and also a teacher. She has covered film and culture since 2016 for Vox. She's been a prolific critic for a whole decade prior to coming there. Her works appeared at Rolling Stone, Bon Appetit, Washington Post, Vulture, RogerEbert.com, The Atlantic, Books and Culture, Los Angeles Review of Books, Pacific Standard, and elsewhere. She's a member of the New York Film Critics Circle, also the National Society of Film Critics. She was in 2017-18 the Art of Nonfiction Writing Fellow at Sundance, of the Sundance Institute. She was previously at CT. She teaches English and Humanities in New York City, where she's worked since 2009. And I think there are 3 books. Last year, Salty, Lessons on Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women. A forthcoming one, we Tell Ourselves Stories, and then one she wrote with a guy named Bob Joustra called How to Survive the Apocalypse, Zombies, Cyclones, Faith, Politics Near the End of the World. She's got a degree from NYU, an MA in Humanities, and an MFA from Seattle Pacific. So welcome to you both. Brad, over to you.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks everybody. It's really, it's fun, it's a privilege to talk about this subject because it's one that I actually don't get to talk about at all in my workplace. So it was, for me, I thought, given the prompt questions, I wanted to start by taking kind of a more oblique angle, or in camera terms, even a wide one, to these questions, given our very obvious conditioning to view these sort of colossal counterparts of Hollywood and religion as, as these sort of cultural nemeses that have little in common except their sort of mutual distrust. But I've long had the conviction as a Christian who sort of works in that most Babylonian workplace of all, Hollywood, that there actually is, in my estimation, maybe no place on earth that is sort of more spiritual in concentrated terms than the film and TV business in LA. And, the very name Los Angeles denotes a place that belongs to the angels. And I would even go a step further to use the word religious in terms of Hollywood. Not in the sense of organized religion, of course, though that really is there aplenty. But when you think about it, this is a system which feeds and sort of feeds upon the human instinct not only to worship, but to be worshipped like no other. And it's an industry which really doesn't just traffic in transcendence, but whose economy is sort of built upon transcendence. When you think about the word transcend etymologically, meaning to climb across, which is what the constant content of film and TV attempt to satisfy, that relentless human need to climb across everyday circumstance, both in horizontal and on the vertical plane as well. So in this light, it sounds a little cheeky, but I kind of tend to view Hollywood as a Vatican City in spite of itself, and kind of in spite of the great pride it takes in its badge of secularity. And I don't say that in any way as kind of an embattled Christian with any axe to grind against Hollywood. And in fact, actually, it really kind of fascinates me to no end when you look at it in this sort of cultural anthropological lens. And in preparing this talk, I was reminded of a 1998 essay for Image Journal, which is a quarterly journal of arts and faith, which Alyssa and I have both been affiliated with. And in this issue, which was titled Screening Mystery, and it was dedicated entirely to the film business, the Dominican priest and scholar Michael Morris gave substance to this notion that I had when I first sort of entered the business as a nascent TV writer and a future producer, showrunner. And Morris opens the essay in ancient Egypt, where this splendid temple built in honor of Ramses II featured his image among the gods to spectacular scale in the sanctuary's darkened interior, a space which was constructed in a way that when illuminated by the sun, it did so to sort of dazzling effect. And this effect found its latter-day analog, according to Morris, in the movie houses in the grand heyday of Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s, whose architectural heritage was explicitly Egyptian in their oversized grandeur, their golden iconography, and really their sort of blatant branding as such. This sort of pseudo-numinous pop phenomenon, Grauman's Egyptian theater, being in Hollywood being the first of many to sprout up across the country in the 20s and 30s, wasn't the only parallel, as Morris explains, as the studio heads kind of ran the business like high priests, charged with mediation by way of media between the laity in this kind of veritable pantheon of silver screen celebrities. So going to the movies wasn't really like a pilgrimage, it was a pilgrimage to pay homage to these newly fashioned gods of the modern era, and who could be found behind a curtain, just like in the Holy of Holies and the first and second temples of ancient Jerusalem and its Near Eastern antecedents. And so I find this to be really a wonderful lens at which to look at Hollywood and really understand that they have so much more in common, these sort of twin pillars of religion and entertainment in our contemporary American society. Today, of course, we really have nothing but a drab cineplex for the movie-going ritual, and more often than not these days, a pilgrimage to nowhere. where except on this small screen of one's TV, laptop, or even phone. But nevertheless, the heritage reminds us that the age of cinema might have been a grand invention, but it wasn't a pure creation without this sort of ancient DNA. And none of this really should be surprising to us because the evidence abounds by now that theater has its primal roots in religious ceremony. So Aristotle and his dramatic concept of catharsis was taken directly from the tradition of ritualistic sacrifice, whose literal lifeblood was the liturgical catharsis, which theater attempted to emulate by way of drama. And as the French critic and theorist René Girard put it, once upon a time, a temple and an altar on which the victim was sacrificed were substituted for the original act of collective violence. Now there is an amphitheater and a stage. And now today there are screens everywhere, big or small, small enough to fit in one's pocket. So for all of these cultural parallels between the domains of Hollywood and religion, why all the apparent enmity between them? Is it their competing claims on the human heart and imagination? Is it their divergent evaluations of the human condition? One seeing fit to give us a constant supply of fictional heroes and superheroes, the other a savior whose miraculous feats from creation to birth, healing, and resurrection defy any of the illusions that film and TV have to offer. And again, I'm really speaking specifically to Christianity here because that's my tradition, and because, as we well know, it kind of has the singular distinction of being very much the enemy in question on one side of today's culture wars. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. It's a very politicized Christianity that I'm talking about. But I've come to wonder over time, is the apparent enmity itself kind of an illusion? And this is what I really have come to believe after almost more than 25 years in the business. As Josh stated, my first job in Hollywood was HBO's first 1-hour drama Oz, set inside a maximum security prison whose cast of characters included two people of the cloth. There was the prison chaplain, Father Mukata, played by B.D. Wong, and the nun psychologist, Sister Peter Marie Raimondo, played by Rita Moreno. The show's creator, Tom Fontana, is a Jesuit-educated trailblazer in TV whose previous shows had included St. Elsewhere and Homicide, and with a couple of Emmys under his belt, when the freedoms of cable fell in Tom's lap before anyone else's, he was determined to take on matters of faith and religion as much as murder, mayhem, and the general brutality of prison existence. It wasn't really all downhill from there for me in terms of working on a show that could explicitly deal with religious themes in a mainstream drama. And I have had the good fortune of working on a couple of others along the way. In 2008, I worked on NBC's Kings, a modern retelling of the King David story. And in 2013, I worked on USA's Dig, a thriller set in Israel about clandestine efforts to bring back the very temple sacrifice referred to by René Girard, and with it, the apocalypse in the process. Dig was certainly one of the more unlikely shows to have ever existed on TV in its short-lived existence, but really, I wish we could have a projection here because nothing captures my feelings about the intersection of faith and Hollywood than a photo I have of our base camp right outside the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where you could see sort of film trailers parked right below the retaining wall. It was wild. These three shows constitute kind of a sporadic hat trick in my overall run from 1998 until now. I would include The Americans in that show's commendable exploration of the daughter's turn toward faith, but that storyline actually began after my work on the first season, so I can't take any credit for that. When I first ventured beyond Oz and my working with Tom Fontana into the writer's rooms of Big Bag Hollywood, I did so kind of as a Christian embarrassed to wear my faith in the writer's room. It would really sound silly, even offensive, to claim minority status as a white guy in a business run largely by white men. But upon entering my first writer's room, I knew well enough that no way to win a popularity contest there would be to admit one was a Christian. Plus, I grew up in the Episcopal Church among the frozen chosen, as we were dubbed. And so I had none of that sort of evangelical fire to really thaw my self-consciousness in possibly hostile territory. But at the same time, I started blogging for Image, which was a chance for me to speak openly online about matters of faith, while at the same time sort of keeping my mouth shut at work. And in one post, I took issue with what struck me as the generally condescending portrayal of Christian characters on screen, who seem to either be monsters on the one hand, losers on the other, or some kind of freakish hybrid in the middle. A reader took issue with me and with this post, took me to task for my blunt categorization, and gave a long list of characters in TV and film who sort of defied that. And so I came away thinking that, wow, I'm probably not fit to make such judgments. But I also came away thinking, I know I'm also still right, and to a degree. And that if I were to sort of poll this room, myself included, for favorite characters in TV and film whose Christian faith, religious faith might define them in a winning way, we'd probably have a bit of a hamstrung exercise on our hands. And, you know, aside from notable exceptions like The Americans and now Beef, how often do films or shows take the life of faith seriously in a character characters who are normal, likable, and to use that sort of favorite buzzword in Hollywood, relatable? More likely, we'll be treated to the preacher in The Last of Us, in which sort of the most heinous element of all in that gut-churning show, spoiler alert, cannibalism, is reserved for a Christian villain who also suffers the most vicious killing of the season. And I say that as a fan of the show. I really thought it was amazing in many ways. But really, I'm very careful to not take up that axe to grind. And to that end, I plan to ask Alyssa about this point and how much she agrees or disagrees with that categorization. These days, I've grown more comfortable with age and frankly with just seniority in the writer's room as an executive producer when it comes to sort of identification as a Christian if the subject comes up. I suspected early on that my self-consciousness about the matter had a lot more to do with my hang-ups than anyone else's. And kind of like Trey said yesterday, I have found colleagues to be generally receptive, even curious, sometimes hiding behind tall stacks of baggage just like me. But I will say that the extreme polarization brought about by the culture wars in these past several years has made me very reticent and careful at times all over again for different reasons about sort of speaking to that matter, identifying as a Christian, as a person of faith, just because of how fraught those issues are, and all the more so, in a workplace. But these partisan horrors aside, the studios know that there is a huge demographic out there quite hungry for religious-themed content, be it straight-up biblical fare like The Chosen, or shows like Beef with a more nuanced and complex spiritual angle. How to service that appetite is really a leading question for their programming models going forward. And as the streaming market really seeks to balance broad appeal with greater and greater possibility for niche audiences. And it's easy to think that this agenda is all about the bottom line and profits for their shareholders. That's true. Ever since, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ squarely put a cross and a $sign in the eyes of every studio head running the business since then. And they are perennially challenged and vexed about how to deliver more material like that in today's very fraught society. But really, I say that partially a little tongue-in-cheek, and a recent experience that I had on a pilot project this past year tells a different story, which I'll just share briefly in closing. Commissioned by Universal Television to co-write the first installment in a prospective biblical anthology series, I set out with my creative partners on the project to create an 8-episode limited series about the Nativity. Our goal was, and still is, to kind of thread the needle with a show that remains faithful to the source material in the New Testament, but at the same time really holds its own and stands on its own 2 feet in this era of peak TV. Mary and Joseph wouldn't be just sort of glowing, distant icons in a glowing manger, but husband and wife mired in a riveting marital drama. And the wise men, or the magi, not these avuncular wise men as we're so used to seeing them, but really formidable mystics steeped in the Babylonian occult. Fortunately, the studio had the same goal as we did. And while I know I'm not supposed to say anything nice about them while I'm on strike, I really can't compliment them and their partners at Peacock enough for how helpful they were and how much they helped enhance the project from pitch to outline to script. Here was a group of executives with little exposure to the Gospels, as far as I could tell, whose main objective was just like ours, and to help us deliver the show that we sought to deliver and sort of live up to these standards of excellence. And when a Hollywood Notes call in 2022 involving Christians, Jews, atheists, agnostics, who knows what else in the mix, leaves me feeling that a pilot script about the birth of Jesus Christ was all the better for it, I came away from that really feeling a kind of a new and different sense of hope for myself and for the business. So where are we headed? I don't know, but that might be something that Alyssa and I also talk about, and maybe in answering some of your questions. The pilot script that I just mentioned, it falls squarely into the genre of straight up biblical fare. And while it's crucial that we keep striving to help bring that genre out of the choir stalls where it has far too often preached and into the upper echelons of great drama, that's hardly the extent of the job. Of true urgency, as I see it, is the need for sort of contemporary Christian characters of any faith, in that relatable, and to use another Hollywood buzzword, rootable vein. They can and should be as flawed as any other characters on screen, but can they please also be smart, resourceful, talented, funny, and ultimately as complex and complicated as we want our main characters to be. I can think of little that might actually help bridge the gaps, even a tiny bit, in today's culture wars, as this kind of approach in TV drama. And I think if I held a high-ranking position in today's church, I might want to come up with a ministry and devote untold resources to just simply help educate, train aspiring Christian screenwriters with no strings attached, no proselytizing agenda, but just help really close that gap. And I think it just goes without saying. I mean, look at how effective the LGBTQ movement has been in this regard. Having long suffered the stereotypes that rendered them in the extremes, from either brooding social outcast to flamboyant bon vivant or quirky sidekick, today they have the likes of that very beautiful and moving 3rd episode of The Last of Us to mark the strides that they have made. So to close, in the introduction to The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism, Recently deceased pastor and author Tim Keller quotes the literary critic Stanley Fish, who was asked how to account for the rise of Christian professors in the academy despite its general secularism. Fish states, "When Jacques Derrida died, I was called by a reporter who wanted to know what would succeed high theory in the triumvirate of race, gender, and class as the center of intellectual energy in the academy. I answered like a shot, religion." Fish's forecast, it seems, has yet to manifest, and that familiar triumvirate appears to be more front and center than ever, of course. But with the warp speed arrival of AI into everyday headlines alongside those leading social issues, I won't be surprised if Fish proves right in ways he did not see coming. Nor will I be surprised, in fact, if it isn't long before Josh and Faith Engel Forum are hosting panels on the much feared role of AI, not just in Hollywood storytelling, as the Writers Guild is determined to prevent currently on our strike, not just in journalism as well, as it pertains to all of you, but even in matters of faith, given we've already seen a recent church service in Germany led by a chatbot and attended by hundreds. And so now that a potentially common enemy is at their doorstep, perhaps these cultural nemeses, these antagonists of Hollywood and religion, can team up at long last to find their innate common ground in anthropological terms and combat the coming desecration to both camps. And wouldn't that make a great movie? Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, so I'm usually, I lecture for a living, I teach, so I'm usually a little more organized than I'm going to appear here, and I'm just like apologizing. I have a series of observations about the direction of Hollywood in particular, as it relates to religion, and also how trends in Hollywood are changing the way that we experience film and the TV and communal experience. I want to say up front that I've been writing about religion and pop culture, both in religious media. I was at Christianity Today for many years, and then in the mainstream media for a long time. And it's kind of helped me formulate an idea of what do we mean when we talk about religion. And I'm going to use film a lot because that's my genre, but I always also mean TV. And there's sort of three buckets I think about. There are movies that are marketed toward the religious as a market category. It's a market segment. It is, as Brad said, a market segment that Hollywood kind of realized existed in 2004 when The Passion of the Christ came out. So I just want to underline that remains the highest grossing R-rated film of all time in absolute numbers. And that came out in 2004. So that's wild. And the reason for that was that the studio smartly targeted churches and pastors as blocks. And churches bought out whole theaters. That's how I saw it. And there was a real sense, if you were a Christian at that time, that if you didn't go see The Passion of the Christ, you were like not committed enough to your faith, because like, yeah, it's violent, but like Jesus actually went through it, right? And you just have to go watch it. It was a very effective marketing tactic. And it's also a market segment that doesn't go see R-rated films much, which typically they make like half of what their PG-13 cousins make. So that happened, and every studio suddenly had a faith-based arm, which really meant like sort of nebulously Christian content is really what they meant by that. And that happened for about 10 years. And this is right at the height of independent film kind of getting into the mainstream as well. And then God's Not Dead came out in 2014. And God's Not Dead, which you can read my extensive rants on the subject if you want, but God's Not Dead was shot for $2 million and made $60 million. And so that birthed Pure Flicks and a new era. And even though every subsequent God's Not Dead movie has like halved that return, it's still built Pure Flicks. And if you don't know, there's like a very thriving sort of entire studio and streamer that is out there that's like an alt universe Netflix, basically, for Christian content. Okay, so that's one market category. The second thing that I think about when I think about religion in film is a lot of what Brad was just talking about, which is religion as a subject in some way. So we can think about The Chosen is a good example, extremely popular. The CW just picked up this show, which had been has done 3 seasons on VidAngel, which is like a platform that most people don't know exists either. The CW just picked it up to have rights, so they know that this is a hugely popular show, which is about Jesus and his disciples. And I haven't watched it, but I've heard from sources I would never expect that it's good, so I probably need to get around to it. So that's religion as the topic of the show, or at least a major topic. And you can think of lots of other examples, I'm sure, some of which I think are very, very good, and some of which are maybe less good. One show that everyone seemed to watch, I think because it came out on Netflix in March 2020, was Unorthodox, which was like a 4-episode drama about a young woman leaving an ultra-Orthodox community. That did very, very well. And there's a lot of that kind of thing where the religion is the subject. And then there's this third category, and it's honestly the one that I'm most interested in, which is art that is looking at religious questions. Maybe it's not specifically about a religion, but it's asking religious questions. I think the best example of this, and probably the best show ever made, was The Leftovers, which was on HBO, and is sort of about like, what if the rapture happened, but it's not at all. That's not really what it is at all. It's something entirely different. And if you've watched it, it's like completely devastating, but incredible. And by the end of it, the characters have confronted many questions that religions seek to answer, and the audience is led into those questions as well. And so you've kind of got religion as a market category, religion as subject matter, and religion as sort of the inquiry of the work itself. And those actually have to be talked about in 3 separate ways, because we're not talking about the same thing often when we're having conversations about religion and pop culture. So one other observation I want to make about that, sort of in the Passion, God's Not Dead, 2 important moments. A third important moment was in, I believe it was 2016. I can't believe I don't know the year. I think it was 2016. Martin Scorsese's Silence came out. Maybe it was 2017, which is based on a kind of a classic work of Christian fiction by Shisaku Endo. It's a widely read book from the 70s, I believe, about priests in the 1700s going to Japan and sort of encountering some really deep and disturbing questions. Anyhow, it's an incredible movie, and when it came out, the studio pretty much buried it, and it was very confusing. Why would you bury a movie by Martin Scorsese starring Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield and Liam Neeson? Like, why would you do that? And it turned out, sort of back-channeling, I started to hear that the studio was very worried that it was going to be protested the way The Last Temptation of Christ was 25 years earlier, when also Scorsese. And so they still had this perception that the way people approached Last Temptation was going to be the way that they approached Silence, which actually felt like a very odd perception to me, because that's simply not the kind of thing that happens with movies anymore. They don't even kind of matter as much. But that is something that like executives are thinking about in Hollywood and sort of navigating that. So I think that's all very interesting. Okay, so I have 3 buckets of observations I want to make. The first one is sort of trends in storytelling and voices in Hollywood, and just things that I've seen happening over the 15 years that I've been writing about film. One is that in the storytelling vein, the 2 kind of big heavy hitters, money-wise, have been superheroes, obviously, and apocalypses and dystopia. And it's not just because I wrote a book on that, but those are the 2 ways that you kind of make a very big, successful thing. And it's interesting to me that both of those, I would say, are exploring religious questions always. Not that the apocalypse itself is a religious thing, but It always leads people to inquiries about things like, what is the meaning of life? What do we owe to one another? What does a just and good society look like? What's really going on beneath the surface? So that's just interesting to me, that as we've been moving into the 21st century, that's really where Hollywood has gone. Also, there's been a move to being more inclusive in the voices that are telling stories, right? It is true that the vast majority of Hollywood's writers and directors have been white men, mostly of some kind of Episcopalian background, right? That's they're all WASPs. They've always been WASPs, and there's been lots of movement towards trying to change that. It's a drop in the bucket, really, but you can see it in Hollywood, certainly. So people from different, people from different gender backgrounds, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people with different life experiences, and there's programs at the studios to bring more people in. The Oscars, starting this year, I believe, have some really very basic new rules about qualifying for Best Picture, and those rules include explicit things about having diversity programs at your studio, or was your movie, all the top people in the movie a white guy, then you can't qualify for Best Picture. So this is new this year. People are losing their minds, of course, but it's actually very basic rules that most studios qualify for, of course, because they wrote the rules. But that's just a signal that that's something they're trying to move towards. And what this has led towards, I think, or it feels like what I'm seeing, is that when religious experience is involved in a TV show or a movie, it's often contextualized within the culture of the character. So I'm thinking of, let me make sure I'm thinking of it correctly. Yeah, so for instance, there's a show called We Are Lady Parts. Has anyone seen this show? Oh, okay, it's wonderful. Have you seen? Yeah. So it's wonderful. I mean, it's a comedy TV show. It's on Peacock, I think. It's British, and it's about 4 Muslim women in London, all of whom have very different experiences. And they form a punk band. That's the name of the band's name is We Are Lady Parts. And the show is just basically about their friendships, their lives, and their punk band. It's not about what it is to be Muslim in London. That's not the subject of the show, but it's very much foregrounded because that's their lives, right? Or we can think of Beef when, a Korean church service comes up. It's not like this is a show about the Korean church. It's just this is a show where, of course, somebody goes to church because that's what his character would do. This show Kim's Convenience, which is on Netflix, a Canadian show, also spends a lot of time at church for very similar reasons. Of course, these characters are at church because that's who they are. That's what they would be doing. I also see this in the movies a lot. So the movie Lady Bird, Greta Gerwig's movie, which is incredible, spends quite a bit of time with Catholicism, in part because the main character is in Catholic school, but also because the voice of wisdom in the movie is the nun who runs the school, and she quotes Simone Weil and does all these things, and it's very interesting. But it's all kind of inside the context of the characters, not the point of the show. And I think a lot of that comes from having people with a more diverse set of perspectives in the writer's room or behind the keyboard. Another aspect of this that has to do with the voices, and again, I'm really not praising Hollywood for its diversity because it's this much, that's happened, but it's something. But Netflix in particular brings a lot of international content to subscribers in a way that wasn't happening for Americans. Americans don't like to watch things with subtitles. And somehow Netflix has managed to break a couple of world shows toward American audiences. And world cinema and TV tends to be a little more plugged into religion as a subject, just because it's often more embedded in the cultural context. So I think that's really interesting. So the second category is business. which I'm just using to talk about some shifts in the business that are having an impact on this topic. One is obviously, well, it's Hollywood. Every shift in Hollywood is due to new technology. Like that's always the case, whether it was the development of film that literally could show you moving images, the sound, color, right, all this stuff. So the big development recently, of course, was streaming. And streaming has altered the landscape in ways that we're only kind of starting to understand, I think, as far as like what gets made, who watches it, who gets to make it. This, of course, also, we were talking about this yesterday, means that the business suddenly has giant piles of data about its viewers that it never had before, and knows how to target them in like almost creepily specific ways, right? The Netflix recommendation algorithm is really wild, or what TikTok shows you is really crazy. And they're sitting on this pile of data. And this means that they can actually tell if people are watching things and where they stop watching them and what they're interested in and which things they go back and rewatch. And that makes it easier to like give data that says, actually, we should make this show because we know that most of our viewers will watch this show, or that many of our viewers, or maybe it'll be a demographic that we want to pull in. This is entirely why the CW picked up The Chosen, or we can think of a show like Yellowstone, which is hugely popular across America and watched by very few coastal elite types, right? And now they really know who's watching it, why, when they watch it, what day they watch it, when they stop, what they rewind. But on the flip side, I do think that the obvious thing that this causes is less of a communal narrative for huge groups of people, right? You're more targeted, you watch your own thing, and there's fewer shows that break across demographic lines. I was just looking this up. So especially in media, we had the perception that everyone in the world was watching Succession. And the finale episode of Succession that just aired had its largest viewership ever, which was 2.9 million people. I believe that's air date plus 48 hours or something, because it's on HBO Max. The finale of Friends had 52.2 million viewers. And that was like 20 years, not quite 20 years ago. So that's a huge, huge shift. I even looked up Yellowstone's 5th season premiere had 12.1. That's a monster hit now. And Game of Thrones finale a few years ago was 19.3 million. And that's like the biggest show, of our time. So from 52.2 down to Game of Thrones not quite getting 20 million people is massive. And that changes everything. It changes how much money is being thrown at different things. It changes what people are looking for. And it changes how we talk about it, which leads to a third thing that I'm going to talk about in a second. But that also is tied to the drop in theatrical viewership, of course, for films. And I was thinking about this yesterday when Carolyn mentioned collective effervescence and how having people in a room together does make a difference in how you encounter the art. And theaters are kind of the closest to churches or houses of worship that we have in a secular space, in that you enter it together, you sit there for 2 hours, you kind of give yourself over to the experience, something literally larger than you, and you respond to it. And if you've ever had like a really great theatrical viewing experience, like you never forget it because it is akin to religious experience. I will never forget going to see Get Out before anyone had seen it. It was the first press screening. And we were all, the last movie that Jordan Peele had done was Keanu, with this like stoner movie with the cat that talks. So that's what we were expecting. And about 3 minutes into that movie, you realize like, oh no, this is a different kind of a movie. This is gonna be awesome. And just like the electricity you could feel in the room. But you can't have that experience watching a screener at home. You can get excited. It's just not the same thing. We know this, but it does change the way, again, that we're experiencing art together as a culture. Then Brad mentioned AI. I can talk for hours about AI, so I'm not even going to. But the question that's most in my mind right now about AI, besides is it going to take my job, is will people want to watch things that they know are generated through AI? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. But it does feel like a fundamental shift in the question of what makes us human. and why do we touch art? So that's that. And then there's labor issues in Hollywood. I don't know that any of that is explicitly tied to religious concerns, but one thing that is that the way movies make their money now is mainly in China, honestly. So every Hollywood blockbuster is made to be exported in a much bigger way than it used to be. There's an incredible book called, oh boy, I think it's called Red Carpet. I interviewed the writer of it, who's a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and it's about the history of Hollywood and China's involvement over the past, like basically since 2000, and it is a fascinating read if you want to understand how the business is changing. But a thing that happens when you export is you have to work with those countries' censors, right? So certain kinds of content isn't going to fly in Iran, and it's not going to fly in China, but it might be different, right? And religious content is actually one of those things that they have to think about. Or if you've ever noticed, Disney loves to get really excited about how it has like an openly gay character or something, and they'll trumpet it, and then you see the movie and you're like, where, right? And it's because they have to make it tiny so they can just lift it out without any problems for to be on like UAE's or on Emirates flights, for instance. They won't allow any gay content. So that's really reshaping what gets big money. So an independent filmmaker might have more resources now. Tech is cheaper. You have more ways to distribute your movie, and you can make incredible movies about things that matter deeply to you. And on the flip side, if you want to work in the big budgets, there's a lot of market pressures that are happening. Okay, so the last category, we talked about this a little bit at my table the first night, but is audience. And that has to do with contemplation and meditative states that we kind of get in with art being obliterated. But I think the more important one, and the one that we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about religion, is fandom. Because fandoms, which is just a community, well, it sounds like it should be just a community of fans, they really are religion now. Like, no exaggeration at all. So this is like a fandom that forms around, Star Wars is a pretty good example, I think, because, I like Star Wars, I enjoy Star Wars. I don't know if I'd call myself a fan, but I think it's fun. I also know people who like and enjoy Star Wars and have characters and read the books, and I'm describing my husband now, right? But the fandom is a group of people for whom that is their identity. I am a Star Wars fan. It is their identity to the extent that they send, poor Rian Johnson, after he made The Last Jedi, just death threats, doxing. I got long emails from people who were like, I hope he gets cancer. And it has to do with ownership of the narrative and the property, feeling like they deserve to receive something from the work or the person. This isn't movies, but Taylor Swift's fandom, for instance, have spent weeks litigating with themselves as to whether they should go see her in concert because she's dating, or she isn't anymore, but she's dating that Maddie Healy, and they're like, oh, we don't like him, so maybe I get rid of my concert tickets, right? And it all sounds really fringy, but it's not. It's actually driving the entertainment industry at this point, and more importantly, it's filling that gap that we keep talking about for a lot of people who aren't attached to institutions, maybe are quite isolated for various reasons or feel isolation. And maybe they just like, Justice League, right? And they just like it, and they get on Twitter and they find the community, and it kind of spins itself up into a religious frenzy. And everything in life is now, we pore over the text, we look for the hidden meanings, we write our own versions of the text, right? Fan fiction. We go to conventions and things. These things that used to feel like something that just nerds did now is pervasive, to the point where it can be scary to be on the internet if you are going to write about Batman, right? Because I get death threats for poorly reviewing a movie that isn't very good, like when Batman versus Superman came out, whatever that stupid movie was. That's frightening, but that is that kind of fervor is indicative of something going on in the culture, and how these fandoms become identity for the people involved with them. That shifts community, that shifts how people interact with the narratives, how the creators then kind of work backwards with those IPs and try to please the fandom, because that's where the money comes from. And it is a movement that scares me a little bit. Okay, I have two things left to say. One is there is this parallel thing that I have been writing about recently, which is that the rise of documentary series as cheaply made but very lucrative entertainment has led to cult documentaries becoming and religious documentaries. So there's like all these docs that have been coming out about like Hillsong. There's like 2 documentaries about Hillsong and the rise and fall of that. There was a Jerry Falwell one that wasn't very good. The Duggar one that just came out about the Duggar family and Bill Gothard and fundamentalism in Christianity in the kind of turn of the century. That one apparently is Amazon's most watched documentary series ever. It just came out 2 weeks ago, so that's interesting. And then there's also, for whatever reason, and it's actually a bit creepy, I think, there's like a over fascination with LDS communities, some of which it feels out of proportion, I think, is the thing. And so I don't know what the companies are latching onto exactly as their determiner. But for instance, there is quite a good, I think, doc, at least from a documentary perspective, about Warren Jeffs and the whole thing that went down with the fundamentalist LDS church and the government raided it and whatever. That's on Netflix, and that one has done extraordinarily well. There's been a lot of other shows like that. And there's also kind of a similar rise in things about ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. And that just strikes me as weird and interesting as a social phenomenon, that people are kind of invested in watching documentary series, many hours, about other people's religions, or sometimes their own, but often other people's. But it also, on the flip side, feels parallel to true crime, which is sort of about like bad things that happened and then maybe how to avoid them. And that all, I think, it shows that there's a market for that content, and what that means about people who maybe haven't had experience alongside religion and are only receiving that information through docs about how crazy religion is, has, I think, pretty big implications that really it's only arisen in the last couple of years. Okay, that's a whole bunch of things. I'm sorry that it's a little scattered, but I wanted to make sure that all of those things were out there so that in case they spark questions for anybody. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I bet it did spark questions, so more or less over to you. I did check. Red carpet was 2022.
Yeah.
You nailed it on the content type, and then silence was 2016.
Okay,
A
good.
scholar always gets the dates right, even if they're uncertain. How about we start with Lily Fowler from NPR?
Yeah, and actually Nina, but
I'm so sorry.
I can be Lily today.
You are. Nina Shapiro from the local.
Yeah, thanks. That was so interesting.
Maybe hit that button if you would.
Oh.
You know, just make sure we get it.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That was so interesting. I have a couple questions. One, Alyssa, you talked about WASPs being the dominant power in Hollywood, and of course there is a pervasive idea that Jews are the dominant power in Hollywood. And just look at Dave Chappelle's monologue and the kind of furor around that. Is that wrong? And I mean, and what is the reality of that? I mean, obviously there was and is a Jewish presence in Hollywood, but what are people understanding or misunderstanding about that? And what is today's rise in anti-Semitism? How is that feeding how Hollywood is perceived? Yeah. So that's one question. And then another, Bradford, you talked about ways of bridging the divide by presenting more nuanced portraits of Christianity and Christian people. I wonder, given, Alyssa's point about the ways markets are segmented and how we don't have a communal experience, about the possibilities of that. And I think back a lot to All in the Family when I was a kid. And the ways that taught us and let us discuss the generational and political differences that were happening at the time, and how we don't have that today, either politically or, I think the same could be said about, religion and some of the overlapping differences there. And I wonder, could we make an All in the Family today, and why we don't have that?
So I don't have numbers on the exact kind of demographic breakdown beyond knowing sort of generally what who's at the top of things. But what I can say is that this interesting thing happened in the 30s and 40s at the dawn of the studios era, which was that there were a lot of Jewish men at the top of the studios, but they often were immigrants, had just immigrated, and they saw it as literally their moral duty. You can go back and read them saying that to prop up specifically the American experiment. That was what they did, and often they did this through working with content that would have content. They didn't call it content back then, but they were creating and pushing content specifically because they felt it was their moral duty to kind of invest in dominant American society, and morale. There was all this kind of feeling that you mentioned this, but we are the guardians of America's morality. This is why the Hays Code came into effect, which was a Presbyterian minister who was in charge of that, right? Which, was dominant for 30 years in Hollywood and dictated what you could and couldn't see on screen. And so I think there is still kind of that feeling often that Hollywood, there was the 70s, whatever, but now it's more like Hollywood is here to remind us that America is great, even if it's just through our superheroes or our action heroes or whatever, and often tends toward kind of the waspy view of that. So the perception of Hollywood being a Jewish town is in part because it is. I mean, it's a lot of the talent. I think you would agree with me on this. I think is coming from Jewish background. It's sort of outsized to the population at large, and that's always been true. But whenever you hear people talking about those Hollywood people, I think it's easy to know that they're usually being anti-Semitic, even if they don't realize it.
So what about, your comment about WASPs?
Yeah. Well, right. So that still is where the top brass are, generally. That's just kind of how it's been.
In that essay that I referenced, Morris talks about how, I think he cites, I believe the book is called An Empire of Their Own by Neil Gabler, about how the Jewish refugees created Hollywood.
Yep.
But he explains what a complicated endeavor this was, because it was that group working sort of in cooperation with a very Catholic dominant sort of ethical commission regarding the content to feed mainly a Protestant audience.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a complicated picture in any sense that it's run by Jews today. I mean, it's just like Alyssa's saying, that is a sort of blatant mischaracterization of the business, despite its heritage. What I would say to your question is, I had that same experience growing up, watching All in the Family. I mean, I watched NBC Nightly News with my parents, and the idea of watching news with our kids today But as far as what I was saying, this sort of this cultural anthropology and the parallels, I think one of my own first insights into it, maybe even before I started digging into the question, was realizing, TV used to be very much of a kind of like a liturgical activity where you would gather at the same time each week, usually with the same group of people, and watch the same show, be it All in the Family, NBC Nightly News, MASH. The numbers that Alyssa cited, the numbers that watched the finale of MASH is like over 100 million, I think. So when you look at that through a religious lens, it bears a lot of resemblance to going to church, going to temple, going to synagogue. And for me, that to me is one of the great losses in the streaming era, is that now, it's all content 24/7, and it just becomes such a more divided, experience even within a family. I'm sure we've all had this, but just the other night, my wife and I were gathered with our kids, and you end up spending more time scrolling through the menu on Netflix than you do watching something. And by the time you decide on something, like, I don't even want to watch anything. It's like I'm done with like the trailers and the menu and the, and I think it's, I lament the loss of that sort of more organized, ritualistic way of viewing content at the same time on the same day on a weekly basis, and often with same other people. So I don't know if your question was, can we bring something back like All in the Family given its political,
Yeah, I think I take all your points about the communal experience and scrolling through Netflix with your kids, done so many times, I can't believe it. But I think there's also the content and the kind of fearlessness that show had, which I don't think we have today. I think that we are afraid to tackle those differences for fear of being canceled on one side or the other, or bringing up taboos or what have you. So I just wonder about that.
There is a show, I haven't seen it, Reboot on Hulu.
I've seen it. Yeah.
Which I think is like that. It's a show that once was sort of scandalous. You have seen it.
It's a little tame.
I haven't seen it. So.
Oh well, I think it's more like the subject of the show is that question. The one that I always think about is Superstore, the NBC sitcom that just ended, which I think maybe the directness of All in the Family has fallen out of favor a little bit, because even when Norman Lear makes shows now, they're a little less. But what's the Cuban show? I was trying to remember this yesterday. There's a show that he rebooted that he had made previously about a single mom. One Day at a Time. Yeah, a great show, I think, and that he, that's his show, and even that was a little more subtle, I think. But Superstore, anyhow, is a show about labor politics, which is just like very funny to watch in the guise of kind of an office style show. But I don't think, I think that my experience of watching all this stuff is that people are much more risk averse now.
Oh, yeah.
So come for the religion integration in Hollywood, rich conversation, but stay for the movie recommendations and for the show recommendations. I'm up to 12 right now. We'll send this out with the evaluation. You get bored on the flight home, okay, it's going to pop up in your inbox. Tom Howman from The Oregonian.
During the pandemic, I remember reading many celebrities, and Don Lemon wrote a piece about how they were going back to the old shows, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, the Andy Griffith Show, and those are like church. And I just looked up on the internet, make sure I had it right. That Hugh Beaumont was a lay minister, and I remember reading about him trying to get morality. So what does that say about our hunger for not necessarily religious, but stories with morals? And I think it's funny how people put that down, and yet Andy Griffith, every time I watch it, I discover something new about life. Now, I know there were issues about not blacks living in Mayberry, but what does that say that these old shows that are so dated live on, and what does that say about what viewers hunker for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one aspect of that is comfort watch. Like, those are easy shows to watch, right? And people also were rewatching, I know this because I was doing it, The Office in particular. I mean, I teach undergraduates, their entire perception of what a 9 to 5, a thing they'll never have, comes from The Office, which I just thought was funny. But actually, the show that, the counter, maybe this is the exception that proves the rule, but I'm not sure if you watch The Good Place on NBC, or really any of Michael Schor's, but that is a show about moral philosophy, literally. That is the topic of the show. And it's very funny and enjoyable. And it was very popular when it was on. And it was, I think, perhaps a good example of a TV show that tries to teach moral lessons. But part of the reason, I think, is because it was on network TV, which is just by design, like, tamer. You can't do as much on network TV. It was designed to be kind of watched by large numbers of people. You know, it was sort of designed specifically to be multicultural and religious. Like, there's kind of a joke right at the beginning where they've just arrived in what they believe to be the afterlife, and they're like, yeah, like, no religion quite got it right. The guy who got it the rightest was this guy Bob, and there's like a picture of him on the wall. And but I think comfort is really a huge part of that. And this is a problem streamers are discovering. I think it was I think it was Bob Iger who said that they are discovering that on Disney Plus, which is like the comfort food platform, like 80% of the viewing is like 20% of the content. And it's just people watching the same stuff over and over again, which de-incentivizes investing in new stuff, because why would you pay someone to make a new show when you can just get the same money from people to rewatch stuff you made 30 years ago?
Yeah, I would add that I think the example you cited with the return to that fair, I think the reality has just become so dystopic itself that kind of programming is actually very counter-cultural, despite its innocence and its purity. It's actually so. I remember a call with my manager a year or two ago, and I had an idea that was dystopic in nature, but no, that was not. People are not buying dystopic because the world itself is so dystopic. And this was at the height of the pandemic and the 2020 election. And that's why we've seen, you know, a greater, I think, incursion of more, or of less rough, dark-edged entertainment, why a show perhaps like Ted Lasso, which is maybe a contemporary analog of some of those earlier 20th century shows, have done so well. So I think in some ways it has to do with what is working against the grain of the moment that we're in. It was easy to make, you know, dystopic material under the Clinton years and Obama, but it's interesting when, you know, the tide turns, and where we are now. That doesn't mean you're not going to see a newly made dystopic movie or TV show, but the market trend works against it.
Yeah.
Eugene, Scott, Axios.
I just wanted to say regarding All in the Family, it's important to realize, in addition to the times that the sitcom was produced, it came in the package of The Jeffersons, also by Norman Locklear, right? And Carol O'Connor's personal politics were liberal.
Yep.
And so I think when there have been efforts to do some type of version of that today, be it, like Roseanne or what's the guy who used to be on the show with the fence? Tim Allen.
Yeah.
These individuals' politics personally are viewed as conservative, and therefore, people, the punchlines did not feel as funny to people who are on the receiving end of it. Whereas you could be like, oh, O'Connor's funny. He wasn't even he's not even from this background.
Yeah.
It's all a bit. And so we're just in different times right now where, kind of not that different from what you were saying regarding fandom.
Yeah.
People really care about artists' personal politics. But one thing, my actual question that I often wonder about, considering, the appetite for conservative, the criticism of liberal art, liberal films by conservatives.
Yeah.
Can you all talk a bit about whatever efforts are being made to actually have more conservative films?
Yeah.
Because the thought would be that the audience is there. And I don't hear enough about this, an effort to please this demographic.
Yeah. I would first off say that the biggest blockbusters tend to be inherently conservative. There's an inherent conservatism to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for instance, right? For the most part. The biggest movie last year was Top Gun Maverick by a long, and that sort of pro-military thing tends to play very well across the country. It was also a great movie, which, doesn't hurt. And Disney usually owns 8 of the 10 top grossers every year. The last few years have been a little kooky, but because they own all the franchises at this point, they are 50% of box office receipts. And Disney is pretty much inherently conservative in almost everything they put out. But that doesn't read as conservative to conservatives often. And so those kinds of movies have tended, I think, to be Christian, but we were talking about this yesterday. It's the least amount of Christian you can be and still kind of count yourself. So they almost never talk about Jesus there. But the Jesus Revolution did pretty well last year. Before that were movies we were talking about Breakthrough. I don't know if anyone saw this movie, but it was it did extremely well. It was based on, it had Chrissy Metz, Topher Grace playing a youth pastor, which is the best casting in the whole world. Several other kind of famous TV actors, and it was a show about a young boy who has a near-death experience, and he's in the hospital, and the whole community comes together and prays, and he eventually recovers, but it's dicey there for a while. And it made $100 million. I can only imagine when that movie came out, that was the biggest profit earner for that studio, partly because it was cheaply made. So these movies do come out, but they don't really break the surface of media. It's been really interesting to see people actually start to cover Yellowstone because it is a phenomenon. It does have famous people in it. And Taylor Sheridan made it, and we know who he is. It's we know this guy. He's made movies that we've seen. So a lot of this kind of stuff, I think, runs under the radar, in part because they generally are either very safe content or they're just kind of not prestige-y enough for media critics to pay attention. There's been a thread going around on Twitter where someone's why is the media obsessed with Succession and not talking at all about young Sheldon, right? And part of the reason is Succession is a show you write about. Young Sheldon is not, right? There's just not much there because it's not meant to generate discourse. And also Succession is about media people, and that's why we all watch it. But that's a reason. And so the content is there and it's making a lot of money. But we just don't know about it, I think. I don't know if you have any.
Half the country's conservative.
What's that?
If half the country's conservative, why aren't there more conservative films?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, how I think there are different facets, to the definition of conservative and liberal, of course, as well. So I think it tends to become kind of an all packaged word. Mm-hmm. And I think, as Alyssa is pointing out, that shows that might not look or present themselves as conservative are in fact conservative, even though they might not be sort of engaging in a political discourse that clearly sides with, say, conservatism.
Yeah.
I was going to say, as Alyssa was making her point, and about these movies that I'm like unaware of, it just hit me that just Hallmark is just putting out stuff left and right.
Hallmark makes more money than ESPN. Yeah. No, it's and in fact, I'm glad you said that, because there's also all the, like, Netflix now has aped the Hallmark thing. Like, they make their own Hallmark movies, and there was a I wrote about this last fall and then I blanked it out of my head. There's a network that was launched called the Great American Network.
With
Candace Cameron. And it was launched by a former Hallmark executive who felt that Hallmark was getting too woke,
right,
because they had like one gay couple and they had like Black people, I guess. I don't really know. And so I sat down and watched a bunch of it, and it's very low production value, but these movies are made super cheap in Connecticut. I know this because a friend of mine has worked on them, and they make so much money. Yeah. So much money, yeah. So they're there, we're just not talking about it.
Yusra Farzan, you're actually in Los Angeles.
This is such a fascinating discussion, and I used to work in something similar prior to journalism. We used to work with content creators in Hollywood and kind of paired them with research, because TV shows and movies have, like, they can shift perceptions even more than like current events. There was a study that showed that Glee helped change perceptions of the LGBTQ plus community versus having a Black president in office.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, right? So my question is kind of similar to Eugene's. You don't really see nuance in the Christian perspective on TV and movies. And I wanted to ask you, Elisa, because you mentioned, there's this drive to be more inclusive, and you sort of see it, right? Yeah. Like, there are shows that show Muslim characters and that experience the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, how they portrayed like Jewish holidays, but you don't really see that nuance in the Christian perspective on TV shows and movies. Except for maybe like Jane the Virgin. I think they kind of portrayed, that Latinx Catholic perspective pretty well.
Yep.
But shows like The Good Place, even like Kim's Convenience, you sort of don't really realize, it feels very non-denominational. Yeah. So kind of wanted to ask about that, like that lack of nuance on the Christian perspective.
I haven't watched much of The Righteous Gemstones, but it is a very popular show. It was tracking way over. There was a point where, I'm sorry to talk about Succession all the time, it's just a good example. Succession was like the 12th most watched movie on HBO at some point, and The Righteous Gemstones was like 6. And it's about a very particular kind of like white megachurch led by a family. But you are right in that I think, and I don't know why, like it doesn't actually, statistically, there should be more people with Christian experience in those rooms than, well, maybe. But I do think part of the problem is just that there are so many different ways to look at Christianity in America, and the kind of communities I would say that there have been some good, there have been some pretty good portrayals of Black churches recently. There was one movie that was at Sundance, and then it went to Peacock, I think, called Honk for Jesus, Save Your Soul, which is like a very interesting, I don't think the movie works on a movie level, but that's not the fault of the content. And that one is set in a Black church with a pastor couple. And there've been a few. We were talking about A Hidden Life yesterday, the Malick film from a few years ago, but it's historic, so I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for why this happens, but I do think there's less of a feeling that we need a concerted effort to improve or the diversity of perspectives. And when they come to us, they're often embedded in a show that's very self-consciously about a cultural identity, like Jane the Virgin. And that's, there were reasons that people were focusing on Muslim representation. One of them being that Homeland was so bad at it, right? But that focus isn't, I don't think, perceived as necessary.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I think that's where, as much as that reader I cited in response to my post, I think I thought that and still think that what I said was right, because there just isn't. We're not used to a lot of nuance, in the portrayal of Christian characters, and I think I don't know. It's a curious question why. I think in some ways, especially in today's market where there is such an agenda behind these shifts in programming, diversity, equity, inclusion. But this question precedes the real arrival of that very obvious agenda. So it's hard to answer it, I think, from the moment we're in, because it would be easy to say, well, there's no need to really present that with nuance, because look at how sort of tied up the Christian church is with the right-wing movement and republicanism and the ascent of Donald Trump, and there's such a power base there that if anything, it should be treated more as an object of scorn or ridicule. So it gets very tricky, but I think this is a question that has really sort of deep roots in the culture, and which does speak to a level of antagonism. Hollywood does not want to be told by the church what does and does not qualify as good, healthy entertainment, and nor does the church want to sort of cater to the hegemony of Hollywood, and
Right.
So I think it's a volatile question. I don't think there's any sort of mystery, as to why it persists. But yeah, so it's a hard one to answer, because it seems like it's such a...
Well, I want to throw in two things. One is, it is an independent film. There's a lot of really good portrayals of, and there's a movie that just came out, The Starling Girl, which I would really recommend watching. But it's a contemporary film. It's set in a contemporary Kentucky about a girl. I really resonated because it felt like I was watching my own teenage years, but it was like a girl in a fundamentalist Christian community. But it's so smart. But that's like one example of the many you can find if you go to Sundance or something like that. The other thing I wanted to say is that it is true that the clergy were allowed to tell Hollywood how they could be portrayed for so long in Hollywood. I mean, it was like 30 years that ministers literally were approving all movies. And that, I think, had an effect on the way that people think about Christianity. I mean, it was a long time ago, but it's really not that long ago. So.
Let's do one more question, okay, and then we'll take a break and check out and come back and regroup. Jack Jenkins, Region News.
So thank y'all for this. It's a fascinating conversation. The first is more just kind of like a say more question to you, because what you brought up about fandom, kind of, I mean, religion has multiple definitions, but in the sense we're talking about identity and purpose, how that is like created this dynamic, not between fans and like the entire industry. But what I find it to be particularly interesting there is that the fans are playing a role in creating, like if the franchise is, in some ways the way they provide meaning, and that's replacing like the divine, to go overly bombastic about it, they're playing a role in creating their own divinity, right?
Yep.
And I'm fascinated by, as someone who's written a lot about religion and media, how you view that dynamic. Relatedly, as mentioned, the political dynamic here is active too, the creation of media to reflect a specific political vision.
Yeah.
And for both of you, I'm curious about, one of the things that was interesting during like the late 90s and early 2000s is there was like this depiction of like particularly like white liberal Christianity and things like West Wing, right? That was kind of like a high mark for like liberal mainliners and liberal Catholics, right? We feel seen, right? And how that has like not necessarily been the case since then. I can think of like one episode in like High Maintenance where I felt like it represented groups that I see involved in like liberal progressive activism. And I'm just curious, what you make of that shift and how that shift is kind of, for you specifically, Bradford, like followed over the course of your career. Have you seen Hollywood shift the way that it encounters with those different distinct faiths?
Yeah, that's hard. That would be hard for me to speak to in sort of a broad, in a broad base, in a broad way. Yeah, I think The West Wing is a really good example. And I don't know, I think it's hard to speak, it's hard to step outside of the moment that we're in and sort of speak back to the last 20 years, because the moment right now is just so fraught. And I just think that the idea of a main character on a mainstream program who is sort of very outward with their life of faith just seems to me like the likelihood of that I would put nil, at this particular moment, because of that risk aversion, that Alyssa is speaking to. So I don't know what accounts, what accounts for that, except for the fact that, at the time of West Wing, it just was, there just wasn't the degree of polarization, that we have today. It was there probably, but it was much more under the surface of things. But I just think that, again, how far the pendulum has swung in reality itself, I think it sort of requires a certain, it's almost like an antidote, like I was saying earlier, why there's not, why this return to this sort of early 20th century programming like Leave It to Beaver in the middle of this very dystopic moment when the buyers don't want dystopic material. I feel like it's almost like a cultural chemistry, and until we get out of, I don't know what will come first. Do we need to get out of the cultural extremities that we're at in order to make room for the kind of nuance and the characters that you and Yusra are speaking to, or is seeing more of those characters portrayed on screen going to help us move out of? I don't know. I don't know how it's going to happen.
Yeah.
One quick related point that's come up a lot in Europe has been that, generally cultures don't do well moving from a culturally hegemonic majority culture to a more diverse, where everybody's now a minority for the first time.
Yeah.
And we tend not to make that turn very well. And Matthew Goodwin of National Populism and Eric Kaufman, who's written on race and what he's called white shift, both say it's a nettlesome time, and ideally you've got reinforcing in institutions, maybe including from the entertainment world, who help make that transition peacefully. But not so well in Europe right now. So
I'll try to keep this brief, but I think so for a fan community, the kind of core texts, whatever the fandom kind of, whatever the core texts are, a set of movies or album by Taylor Swift or whatever, they kind of form around like performing kind of like a hermeneutical examination of the text and really like absorbing it and making it gospel. It's gospel. It's divinely inspired. It's all of those things. And then what's interesting. It's so to me, having grown up evangelical, it feels a lot like when the church revolts on the pastor, right? And it's like, no, you can't, like, you're not leading us anymore, we're leading you. That happens with the fan communities where it's a feedback loop. The difference is that the core text is like made by the deity who is a living, breathing person that we can see, or the corporation. And this is where things get really complicated is, Disney owns Star Wars now. So Disney can hire whoever they want to direct, but they also have a bottom line that they're very focused on. And of course, if you watch The Last Jedi and then watch The Discourse and then watch the next movie, you know that the next movie went through like backflips to try and retract things that the previous movie had suggested. So this almost, the strange thing about being a true fan in fandoms is that it usually almost means that you hate all the new stuff that comes out, because it's like not keeping, and this doesn't make any sense, but it makes sense within the logic of the fandom. But I can't overemphasize how much of this is community, belonging, and identity. It is the source for the real fan of those things, whatever it is. And to the point of threatening violence against people who, it's really quite terrifying. Snyder Bros are considered kind of the worst of these on the internet, Zack Snyder fans. But then you could also see this this was extremely evident when the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial was happening last year. You still can't tweet about Johnny. I wrote a piece from Cannes because Johnny Depp was there in a terrible movie. And I happened to notice that people were passing around the piece and like trying to find my personal information just from having written. And I knew that would happen, but
Depp fans?
Yep.
Yeah.
They're really scary. And this is not just people being like, yeah, I kind of think maybe he was right. It's like, this person must be destroyed because they dared to criticize our God. It's really, and this is the sort of thing that has always existed to an extent, but the internet has made it possible to really calcify in some really disgusting ways.
All right, it's 10:37. Let's take a real break and regroup at 11:10, okay? So finish out checkouts. 11:10, we'll have one more chat, and then we'll go to lunch. All right, friends, well, welcome back. How about if we start with one from Ryan Struck at CNN?
All right, great. All right, so I was hoping, Brad, if you talk a little bit, you mentioned when people find out that you're a Christian and your work, people are genuinely kind of curious, and most people think that, assume that people would be hostile or whatever. I've had a pretty similar experience that I found that people at work are either curious or actually find it like a very valuable thing. So I was wondering if you'd like talk a little more about your experience in that way, and also like why you think there is this like perception that, if I enter an industry like entertainment or media or whatever, my workplace is going to be hostile to me as a Christian. And then Alyssa, I'm interested in the group of movies you were talking about, like Fireproof or Facing the Giants, because our conversation yesterday was about how a lot of these like evangelical hardcore Christians do still cling to these institutions. So like, what are they getting from these movies if like other Americans are maybe finding a like religion there?
Yeah.
Why are they so
That's a great
interested
question.
in that?
And I don't think there's anything special about that dilemma, in Hollywood. I mean, you speak to it in your career, and I would probably feel that whatever my professional field would be, academia, dentistry, name it. I mean, I think it gets a little bit more heightened, in a place like Hollywood, where it's just an industry that is sort of based upon image perception. But again, like I said, I just think that has more to do with me. I just think that's just a function more of my personality, and whether it has to do with, maybe my reserved side or my shyer side or my self-conscious side. Because I know I'm thinking of one in particular, but a couple of friends in Hollywood who are Christian, and very sort of, outwardly so, not in a off-putting way or a proselytizing way. So I think it's mostly a function of personality. And like I said, I just think once I sort of got over the hang-up, I just found like, oh, what a fool that I had been for all those years of just feeling like I shouldn't or couldn't really, mention it or talk about it or claim it,
But there is this like perception, like when I chat with Christian college students or whatever, there is this like perception that like, oh, like if I go be a journalist or I go whatever, like that's going to be a hostile environment. And I just wonder where you think that kind of perception comes from.
Well, I think fundamentally it comes from a sense that it's just not cool, you know, to sort of be a Christian in a way. And that's a very sort of contemporary modern way of saying that. But I just think it's been an age-old, you know, dilemma for the Christian going back to, you know, the time of Christ. I mean, the issue of one's sort of witness or lack of it is one that sort of Jesus himself spoke to. So I don't think there's anything new about it. And we could probably, I would be fascinated to sort of read, you know, a book about that, tracing that through the ages. But I think it becomes accentuated in a culture like ours, and in a time like ours, where those issues of perception and hostility and acceptance are, you know, subject to the media. You know, be it television, be it social media. I think everything just gets magnified.
I want to add something to that because I grew up in the 90s in worldview curriculum circles. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's really good. But it was general, like I spent my Friday nights in these like video studies where they told us about how the world was out to get us and how we were going to conquer the world by having the right worldview. And I think a lot of that perception has persisted. I know when I got to college, I went to RPI, which is just like a STEM school, and I was like shocked that my professors weren't trying to constantly tell me that my beliefs were wrong or something. Perpetuated by the film God's Not Dead, which is about a philosophy professor who, it's based on that internet meme about the philosophy professor who like makes the freshman student sign a paper saying that God is dead in order to pass the class, and the freshman student, I mean, it's quite instructive as a movie to watch. It's really kind of a skeleton key of a movie. So I think that's part of it. And then the flip side of that, having taught Christian college students for the past 15 years, most of them have not had direct experience with people who are Christian and work in Hollywood, or who are Christian and work in journalism. Just geographically, that's generally true. And so that, I think, is part of that perception. It's just like I don't know. I work with the work of Charles Taylor a lot, and just the like plausibility structure is not there for them, that you could be a Christian and work in that field. It's fun, because in my case, they're coming to New York, starting to have direct experience and suddenly realizing that the world is different than they thought it was. To your question about those movies, I love that question. I hadn't really thought about it yesterday, but yeah, so why would an evangelical audience, which tends to be deeply connected to its own institution, what are they finding when other people are finding identity in pop culture? I think there's a couple things that spring to mind. One is evangelicals in particular are used to sitting through 45-minute long sermons with a lot of illustrations. And most of these movies operate roughly on the exact same logic of a sermon. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's very smart the way it works. A lot of them are about football too, and a lot of sermons are about football, right? So there's a harmony there, but it's a little more fun than listening to your pastor talk to watch a movie. So that is, I think, like the apparatus is there mentally for that. Also, a lot of the movies are cast in terms of sharing them with your community. Like, we're gonna have a church movie night and we're all gonna watch it, or like we're gonna watch it in a Bible study. Or there are always, the marker of a Christian movie is that it has to have an uplifting ending. It doesn't have sex or profanity ever. It might have violence. That seems to be fine for some reason. But generally, like, those are the kind of markers. And so by nature, they're supposed to be good for you to watch with the whole family, or at least like your teens, their family entertainment. And that sort of is safe. It's safe entertainment. We want to watch movies with our kids, but we're frustrated that they have things that we don't like in them. And so this, we know, is for us, and we agree with it. And it's at the end, we're going to like have a discussion about marriage, or about how prayer changes things. And then also a lot of them, and this actually happened with mainstream movies between roughly 2004 and 2014, they come with literal study materials like workbooks and books by authors related to it. And in 2004 to 2014, there were publicity firms contracted by the major studios specifically to produce study materials to accompany mainstream films and sell them to churches, because they knew that this was a block that they could sell tickets to, because they saw what happened with The Passion. The one that I used to get a lot of emails about these because I was working at Christianity Today at the time. And the one that sticks in my head the most is they were selling one for The Monuments Men, which is this not George Clooney's finest moment, I would say. It's kind of a boring movie. And I just remember opening it out of curiosity, what Christian lesson are you going to pull out of The Monuments Men? And it was like, as the Monuments Men were redeeming art from the places it had been hidden, so Jesus redeems us from. And I was like, okay, I see what's happening here. But that still persists for those Christian movies. And so it's a community building. It's like a way to enhance your faith, but also feel like, oh, we get to watch a movie, which is a thing we don't always get to do because of content. Yeah.
How about Will Ron from Yahoo News?
Yeah, this is a question that.
Maybe hit that button.
Oh, right.
Sorry.
Okay. Hi, hello. This is a question that is so open-ended, it may not qualify as a question, but.
Would you say it's more of a comment than a question?
I'm just throwing something your way. So, as I was talking with Josh about this, I think if we were having a meeting about religion and Hollywood 10 years ago or 20 years ago, something that would inevitably come up is Scientology.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, at least, is thought of as kind of like a homegrown Hollywood religion. Mm-hmm. And, at the beginning of the century, you had Battlefield Earth and an attempt to kind of mainstream L. Ron Hubbard's stories. Then just about 10 years ago, you had, the combination of The Master and Going Clear. Tom Cruise kind of stopped giving interviews. It was... it became a liability for people like Elizabeth Moss. Basically, I think I'm just kind of asking for a status update. What's going on? I feel like we don't really hear anything about it anymore, though. It's
yeah. Well, Leah Remini has that show. It's a show.
Is that still ongoing?
I think it is. Yeah. I hear, if it isn't, it was very recent that it ended. And that was, Scientology is not popular with audiences, which I think is why it kind of dropped. I'm actually glad you've mentioned Going Clear, because I'm realizing that was kind of the original cult doc. Now that I think about it, that's the Patient Zero. I don't know. I get emails whenever I mention Scientology from the Church of Scientology, cease and desist type, we'll send our lawyers after you kind of things. Which I always think is very funny. And anytime you write about Tom Cruise, if you mention Scientology, you will get mail, as you probably know, which I just think is funny. But I don't know that there is
I think they have just really seen fit to button up their public relations. There was a lot of press. I remember there was just, in the time frame you're talking, more than 10 years ago, there was just a lot of press about some of the very bad things that were happening in Scientology. And then I think, I think the departure of a major figure like writer-director Paul Haggis was a big blow. Mm-hmm. So I just think it's more to do in some ways with their self-management. Mm-hmm. They were exposed.
Yeah.
I think they just have kept their heads down. Mm-hmm. But I've never encountered it, aside from driving by the Celebrity Center on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood. But I know people who have, gone there just almost in a curiosity, in a manner of curiosity, to sort of sign up for a one-day thing. And so it's, I don't know, it still thrives somehow. And it's probably more prevalent than I think we know.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of stars who are Scientologists, and we just don't really know it. You kind of hear stories. Oh yeah, you just hear set stories, and then you learn a certain star is a Scientologist. So certainly hasn't died.
Lauren Gustis with the Salt Lake Tribune.
Thank you. So I took a look at our analytics platform on my phone this morning, and people in Utah, or at least on the Salt Lake Tribune, I don't want to presume, are interested in our Utah Jazz basketball team's TV schedule for next year. That is the most popular story on our site right now. And so I started to wonder if those people are the nuns, and what we do with this unidentified number of people who aren't engaged in streaming or movies or TV, or they're watching sports, or they're doing something else. What would you say to them? What would each of you say to them about what they may be missing, and why they should engage from a, if you will, faith-based perspective?
Engage with
TV or film.
Make the case for.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard because you don't know. I've been better at making the case to an evangelical audience because they're who I know. But I don't think my case would be all that different, which I usually just say, don't you want to be better at understanding other people? Don't you just sometimes feel lonely and wish you could reach out to other people? And I've always said that movies and TV are the lowest lift way to start to understand what someone else is thinking. I don't know how well that plays depending on the audience, right? But when I think of nuns, I think I am encountering the 25% that aren't I'm thinking of my friends who would say they're kind of vaguely spiritual. They might believe in God, but they don't associate with a religion. And they're all very focused on humanitarian and humanist kind of concerns, very plugged into what's going on in different countries, how different people's lives are being led, women's, issues abroad and whatever. And I've always said if you're interested in that, this is a movie you should watch because it'll actually really help you understand what's at stake. And that's the case that I make, which I know is not exactly the question you were asking, but there is a large segment of people who identify as nuns. I think Eugene has said that, that who are actually very interested in others, but they're not attached to the institutions in the same way. And movies and TV are, I hate the term that they're empathy machines. Empathy generating machines, because I just think it's overused, but there is an element of that that's very true. That's where I come out at it.
Yeah, I don't think I would say anything much differently than that.
Except that they should watch The Americans and Oz, Berlin Station.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, to be very candid, I can't imagine finding myself in a position where I'm encouraging somebody to watch TV and film, in a generalized way. There's so much of it in our culture, and when I was a kid, today it's social media, but when I was a kid, TV was the sort of the plug-in drug. So I grew up with a bit of that concern, stigma, attached to it. And so, yeah, I think I would more likely maybe recommend a particular TV show or a particular film sooner than I would. Because my working assumption is that everybody's consuming a lot of television and has been for the past 50 years.
Yes, and my kids are 7 and 10.
Yeah.
And, they're
Yeah.
here on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
They're
Yeah.
not watching a fully formed.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think in that regard, it's a very good point. I think in that regard, there's a much better argument to be made simply for the matter of sustained attention.
Yeah.
Even watching a half an hour episode of something is better for training one's attention span than a 3-minute video.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I took my daughter and my son to a movie last week, and it was like 2.5 hours long, and it was just excruciating for him. Now, if it were a 2.5 Marvel movie, that would have been different, but where you are being sort of fed, that dopamine for 2.5 hours straight. So I think in that regard, yeah, I would.
Yeah.
If it were a matter of TV versus, say, social media, then I would readily make the argument. I would, say what Alyssa's saying, and just add to some, for basic physiological reasons.
But if we go to Isabel Ong from Alyssa's former publication, Christianity Today.
So my question relates to Christmas movies,
Yes.
which I think is a great phenomenon. And I asked this because last year during Christmas time, I did a piece on, is Christmas regarded as a Western holiday in Asia? And the answer resoundingly was like yes. So it kind of has lost that religious connotation. So people of other faiths also celebrate Christmas in parts of Asia. But yeah. And at the same time, as I look at Netflix, it's like when Christmas films come up, a lot of it is about rom-coms, like romantic comedies. So I'm just wondering what you guys think of that trend, and what does it mean as for evangelicals, we lose the essence of the Christmas story. That was my first question, but maybe we can answer that first.
No, do you have a second? Go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
My second question relates more to viewers. As people of faith, how do we, when we see these kind of stereotypes and negative portrayals of people from our faiths in movies, in film, and in TV, what are some ways we can respond to them rather than just like, oh, not again, or this is just going to be the way it's always going to be. I want to kind of see how we can change our response in some way. Is there a possibility of that happening? Yeah.
So to your first question, what you're describing is the Hallmark effect. Those are rom-coms, all of them, and they're all happy endings. They have to be. And so Netflix basically saw that was a huge market and just did the same thing. That's what they're doing. And that's a really recent phenomenon. I think they've had the Christmas Prince or whatever is the first one, and it was in like 2019, I think. So it's very recent. I wrote a piece basically about this question this Christmas because I sat and watched some of this Great American Family Channel Christmas movies, Hallmark dupes, and noticed that they all talk about the magic of Christmas a lot. But they almost never get to the religious angle. One of the ones I watched was Candace Cameron's movie, and that one actually was a Christian movie. That was also a Christmas movie. That was also a Hallmark dupe. It was like, and it actually wasn't a rom-com because the couple were already married, but they had to like find their way back to one another, whatever. But the phenomenon there is that there's no or very little talk of like the reason for the season. But they always talk about magic. And I just found that to be really interesting. And Santa sometimes pops up as the source of the magic in a kind of winking way, but there's this sense, American Christmas is family and magic, and that's apparently what it's supposed to be from the movies. And I just think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And they are huge. They start running them before Thanksgiving now, and people just leave them on all day long. Hallmark, it's really interesting to look at their advertising for this and how Netflix has doubled it. I'll just say to your second question, because actually, particularly when I was at Christianity Today, I wrote about this a lot. And some of that is probably still on the site. But I think, for me anyhow, whenever I see, well, it doesn't really bug me, but it used to. And I think I have come to believe that art is best viewed as a gift, or it's best viewed as the way the artist is trying to process their experience. So I at least when I was there was always writing and trying to encourage audiences to think not about themselves when they see that, but rather what the experience of the person who wrote it probably was and what kind of things they might have run into. And then how can we, as a member of the same faith that's being portrayed, like what can I learn from that about how I encounter other people? It doesn't fix the problem, but it is an issue. And it's much better. I mean, on the flip side, networks do read their mail. And if they get a lot of mail that's protesting something, they actually do read it and think about it. But, obviously being belligerent is never the way to prove how Christ-like you are.
That's great.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think to the first question, and building upon Alyssa's point, it strikes me as a bit of a sleight of hand, on the part of Hollywood to sort of reach that very big demographic who wants that sort of, say, Christian-themed holiday movie, but then to really simply deliver a rom-com with lots of talk of magic. And it's curious how out of step with reality that is, since the holiday season is a time of, extreme emotional hardship for a lot of people. Not that they can or should be delivering movies of that vein, but it certainly could use a lot more of the complexity, emotionally, spiritually speaking, that comes with the holiday season. To the second question, I think there's an onus on somebody like me to sort of, try to bring more of such characters to the screen. I think there's an onus on critics to, call out the shallow characterization of certain, characters of religious faith, be it Christian or otherwise. So, yes, I think we have to do more than simply say, "Oh, here we go again." But rather than just sort of let that slide, even if, one might agree, I think really calling that out is hugely important. My concern now is that with all the importance that has come with the push toward diversity, equity, inclusion, it's actually, and with a bit of terrible irony, created for a great deal of segregation, creatively speaking, within the business. Now you are not supposed, in some ways, you are not supposed to write outside, the box of your own identity, and that's important in ways because it has, it has made for new and diverse voices. My concern is that, with the Americans, you have two Jewish executive producers with Joel Fields and Joe Weisberg writing, about a teenage Christian, daughter in that family. And I'm not saying that can't happen now. It can and hopefully still will, but it's definitely becoming more and more limited in terms of the sort of the license that one is granted in terms of the types of characters you can write about and write in the voice of. So I think it's tricky. Yeah. It's a minefield, it's a minefield.
Yeah.
All right, we've got Eugene Scott and Nina Shapiro, and you're up. Yeah, no, it's not. Nina.
Oh, okay. I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that affects a lot of us who write, and something we think about a lot, actually. Yeah. I would like to hear your thoughts on sex in movies and TV, which I think is one area of religious critique of Hollywood. It struck me, I can't remember which one of you said that, but about the censorship that existed by ministers. Actually, I didn't know that. I knew censorship, but I didn't know that there was a role of ministers involved. It's really interesting. And the way that has just completely shifted in Hollywood to the extent, maybe you disagree, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. But certainly a lot of the movies that I've seen on TV, there's a lot of sex in it. Obviously, people are having sex, first or second date often. And one thing I also, notice, especially as a parent, is, the youth sex. And often, I think Glee, you talk about Glee, like 15-year-old who's supposed to be having sex, and it's no big deal. It's not even talked about, it's just accepted. A lot of those characters are a lot older. The actors are a lot older, so it seems normalized. Right. I think sex education being an exception to that. Anyway, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how sex is portrayed and how it,
I only blink because that is true on television, and the opposite is true in the movies. There's far less sex in movies now than the 90s, for instance. And the big reason for that is, I alluded to, PG-13 movies make so much more money than an R-rated movie that everyone wants to make a PG-13 movie. And so that has to do largely with how many F-bombs you can have in your movie and with sex and sexual content. I mean, the Marvel universe is sexless, basically. Or a friend of mine is fond of noting that The Rock, like Dwayne Johnson, is portrayed as an almost entirely sexless character in every movie he makes. And it has to do with money. So that's just interesting. It is different on TV, but that's in part because cable is just a different universe. I had one more thought on that, and I think it has disappeared out of my head. But I don't have children, so that is part of it. But it is striking. I just, if you go back and watch random mainstream movies from the 80s and 90s, it's actually quite shocking how much gratuitous sexual content there is in Back to the Future or whatever, things that, and it just didn't raise flags. I mean, part of this also is that the MPAA ratings system is very imprecise and just like some people, and so it can be manipulated, and the standards have changed over time.
Do you think another reason is Me Too, that things have become less sexualized maybe in movies?
I think things have become less misogynistic, for sure. I don't know if that's maybe, but I also feel like, I know I just said this, but I feel like objectification of male bodies has become a much more dominant thing in movies. Not necessarily, but every Marvel hero is running around shirtless, and ripped and whatever. But it's just the highest grossing movies are almost inevitably movies that are PG-13 and don't have little to no sexual content. It's not even talked about, which is largely because they want to get the biggest cut. TV, though, is a whole different animal.
I know in some ways it's almost the opposite, I think.
Like Euphoria or those kinds of shows.
I think sex becomes a real sort of, water cooler discussion point for a lot of shows that make explicit use of it.
Yeah.
But it has changed. I think a lot has also changed due to the on-set experience of actors and mainly actresses. So these days you have a lot of these intimacy consultants who are on set to sort of help choreograph the sex scenes. But for me personally, I think just given the porn epidemic, I think it's incumbent upon creators to just exercise real discretion, when it comes. And I was struck by a show like Succession, on HBO, the channel known for its sort of groundbreaking approach, to portrayals of sex. Just how it was just did not exist in the show.
Yeah.
Basically, there was a scene in the first season, and then beyond that, I just can barely recall anything. And so, I think the question that one always has to ask oneself about any point in a story, in a script, is, if I take this out, will the story suffer?
Yeah.
That's just always a reference point that we use in a writer's room when breaking a story or writing a script. And, there's a lot of sexual content in TV where if you took it out, nothing would be affected. Now, and then there are shows like Sex Education where it is just, dealing with it. So I think it's a matter of personal discretion, but it's also much more complicated than that. I mean, you're dealing with sort of, the oversight of your studios and producers, and but yeah, for me, I don't know. It's just odd for me to think that there's still sort of, shock value to be had in showing it on TV. I just feel like we're so past that.
Yes. Yeah, this is the discourse around The Idol, which is the show that replaced Succession in the lineup, which I saw 2 episodes because it premiered at Cannes, and it's very bad and very tedious. But they keep trying to talk about it as if it's this really revolutionary and boundary-pushing portrayal of sex, and A, it's not. They're making it up for the clicks. But B, my friend who I saw it with was like, I mean, there's nothing in here that people haven't done, and also in the age of like porn being freely available on the internet, this is not shocking. This is boring. And they're kind of, it's interesting to see that shift, because that same show 20 years ago would have had a totally different, be making totally different waves.
Yeah.
For anybody who's maybe watching this who's a parent, like Nina, you mentioned VidAngel, which sort of takes those scenes out.
Yeah, well, it's not really illegal. I mean, it's not really legal to
really?
do that. Or they're embroiled in court battles.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the next couple months, VidAngel.
However, AI is going to throw everything, because AI is going to, people will be able to use an AI to strip out that content, right?
Interesting. But there are resources, Common Sense Media is one place that you can quickly go and you find out what's in the, and Rotten Tomatoes will help score it. Are there other resources that you find us go to that are helpful?
I don't use those because I don't have children, so it's really not.
No.
But Common Sense is I think they're kind of the one that I recommend to people when they just kind of tabulate what the content is so that you can make an informed decision about whether you want your kid to see it or your mom. One other thing I will say about the movie versus TV thing, I know we watch movies at home mostly now anyhow, but there is the fact that TV is a thing you watch in your own home, and it is much more uncomfortable to sit in a room full of strangers and watch an explicit sex scene. So that I think does account for some of the shift.
That's interesting. Makes sense. Dustin Gardner, San Francisco Chronicle.
Yeah, I was interested in what Alyssa said earlier about documentary series about certain religious groups. And what really strikes me is just the fixation on certain groups.
Yes.
I think the way Mormons have been treated is pretty unfair.
Yes,
And I think
agree.
Amish people, too, there's a particular obsession there. So I'm just curious what you make of that. Why are certain groups fair game for that?
Yeah, I don't know. I was talking about this yesterday, I guess, because there is an obsession specifically with LDS that is, so last year, this is not a documentary series, but last year the Under the Banner of Heaven series came out. And if you've seen it, you know that it's quite compelling. Andrew Garfield is a very great actor. And also it is somewhat disturbing in how hard it tries to rebut the religion, to the point of recreating scenes from with Joseph Smith, and it's a whole part of the show. And I was talking to a friend who grew up LDS and now doesn't practice anything, and she was like, you would never see this with any other religion ever. And it's true. You wouldn't make a TV show about how a compelling drama about this case that this detective, and then spends like half of it talking about how dumb Jews are. Like, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. And I think I don't know what the answer is. I think it's, we're really fascinated by people who seem to be living with a set of rules that are outside the mainstream. That just makes for good TV. This is why ultra-Orthodox Jews often become the subject of shows as well. The whole Duggar thing is at least partly about this. And I think it's just like, it's gawking, It's appealing because you're gawking at things. I also think some of them have value in part because people are watching them who find themselves they're almost all of those documentaries are about, they boil down to patriarchal subcultures abusing women. That's actually the story at the core of almost every single one of these. And that's the commonality. And a lot of women live in what they don't realize is not normal. And so watching like The Vow or the Shiny Happy People or whatever can be instructive in that sense. But yeah, I think it's like the looking at weird things thing, even when they're not actually weird, but they just are to studio executives and watchers.
Let's go to Hal Boyd.
Yeah, I have a different question, but on that point, I'll just say, in our industry, we have a term called hate reads.
Right.
Hate reads?
Yeah.
I think a lot of Latter-day Saints end up watching some of these things, so it's also an ingrained kind of base market to build off of. So,
that's a good point.
The question I'll ask is, I've noticed that, on airplanes or on like TBS, you'll have edited rated R films. You brought up VidAngel as a vehicle for that. Why hasn't Hollywood done their own? Because they're already doing it, or they're doing it for China, or they're doing it for Emirates Airlines, or they're doing it for. Why did they persist in these battles?
Yeah.
Since, and yes, as someone with children, I would love to have a certain film where I just take out the F word. I don't want my kids, who are whatever, 10, 7, 4, to have to hear that at that age. So, why hasn't Hollywood, is there any theory of why they haven't just done it themselves and taken that market?
Yeah, so one piece is labor unions and their agreements with the unions, and how much the studio can manipulate the product after it's been produced. Like, the guilds have agreements that have to do with who has rights for manipulation. When you see the edited version on TV or on a plane, that falls under a particular, I can't remember all the details, but I wrote a really extensive explainer on this maybe 4 or 5 years ago about the history of this. Because this goes back to I actually think it was a LDS company that was producing edited video cassettes of Titanic and selling them like through catalog. And they got in a lot of copyright trouble with the studio, who were like, we never gave you permission to do this. But when the studios do it themselves currently, it's because they like when they contract with the airline or whatever for it to be there, then they have like a different contract agreement with them than what they show in a theater. I know this is only kind of making half sense because it's kind of a nonsensical thing. There's like a lot of legal issues, I think is what I'm coming down to. But they've been experimenting using AI to dub, like when they do a dubbed movie for another region, to change the the actor's lip movement so that it looks like they're actually speaking that other language. And I'm pretty sure they're just going to start using AI to do this because it's laborious to cut stuff out of movies, right? So you're only going to do it if you're fairly certain there's a big market for it, and they don't know that there is a big enough market. But once AI can do it on the fly, then you can just plug it in and let it go. And that's kind of that's where they land with that. It's always about money at the end of the day.
Well, I'm still going to try it back home and say, hey, ChatGPT, show us Rain Man without the F-bombs, without the sex. For our 14-year-olds, see how it works. I'm just going to try. All right, Yusra.
Such a great discussion. I kind of wanted to make a point as well about the documentaries, because I remember when the Justin Bieber documentary came out, and he was talking very openly about his faith. Paramount Pictures actually released sort of like spiritual discussion guides, because they were targeting the church to sort of get them interested. So it is very interesting how certain religious groups or certain facets within like a religious group, how they are portrayed versus how like people were very accepting of Justin Bieber being very open about his faith.
Yeah.
My question was about periodic dramas, or sort of things that are set, like I Love Bridgerton, The Gilded Age, The Crown, and sort of the absence of the influence of church, like how it's been portrayed. Because if you think of those historic times, right, there was a very big influence of the church, but that is not portrayed on the TV screen. So I wanted to ask about that.
So I think some of this, I don't have a good answer for this, but I do think some of it's related to one of my pet peeves, which is period dramas in which the people are clearly from 2023. Like it's modern characters. The only movie I've seen in years that didn't do this was The Northman, which is so medieval that to be like off-putting to most people. I loved it, but he's just like a esoterica freak, and that's why he does that. But I think, I think some of it's something that I keep coming back to, which is that for a long time, the major influences in Hollywood thought of religion as like a weird thing some people do over here in their free time, and not as something that pervades your existence if you are a religious person. And I do feel like they're catching on sometimes, which is why we're starting to get these characters and stories. But you almost have to be an intellectual historian to like fully grasp how pervasive the church was in people's lives, that this was the ordering and structuring influence of your existence. And that is very hard for a modern brain to wrap itself around, that it wasn't like something you could choose to be part of, and then you could like switch religion. Like that just wasn't how most people thought. And that's hard to portray. And also, it'd be weird if there was like church stuff in Bridgerton. Talk about sex on TV. But yeah, I mean, The Crown should have more. That would make sense. And it doesn't.
I think it's just basically viewed as kind of a third rail in programming. Yeah. That you're just better off not including it, because if you include it, you're gonna hear from somebody. Yep. If it's devout Christians, you're gonna hear from progressives. If it's Muslims, you're gonna hear from Christians. I just feel like it's like there's something about it that just is just that risk aversion, and that it's the safer route is to not show it. Because it is such a third rail in our culture. Of course, it's going to be a third rail in our entertainment. Yeah. And so I think it's that in some level.
And yeah, at some level, that also sort of brings us back full circle. That occasionally, there's God's Not Dead or Beef. Occasionally, some filmmakers, some producers are, and they're choosing to introduce a nugget. And it's strange. After it's been a while, sometimes it can surprise you. Yeah,
and Beef's a great example. I mean, they take that risk if it is a risk, and it's a resounding success. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we ought to thank Alyssa and Brad. This was great. Thank you. Thank you.